Hi, I'm Daz Greenwood at the Boston MIT node of the Computational Law and Blockchain Festival, and facilitator of this unconference discussion session on developing principles for sovereign legal identity for individuals. And I want to introduce my co-facilitator from the Washington, D.C. node, Elizabeth Ramirez, who is currently on mute. Hi.
Hey, Daza. Thanks for having me. Elizabeth Ramirez, as you said, I am a principal at a law and consulting firm here in the DC area, and also global policy counsel to a blockchain-based digital identity company called Evernym.
Awesome. And Evernym is affiliated with the Sovereign Foundation, I think, who actually has some principles, which are among the things we'll be talking about, right?
Yes, that's right. So the Sovereign Foundation is working on something known as the Sovereign Ledger to implement one version of self-sovereign identity. So we can definitely get into that.
Great. And so joining us here in Boston, maybe we can just do a quick round of who's in the discussion. Who are you?
Christian Smith.
Christian Smith from
Stranger Labs.
Stranger Labs, which is into
identity and stuff, privacy.
Right on track. And we, your name?
Northern DC from Ropes and Gray, but I'm not. Frequenter, I would say, of law.MIT.edu things, and always welcome here. And our friend and colleague.
I'm Craig, the CIO with Baker and Hostetler.
So if you kind of wrench your head this way a little bit and look that way, that's what he looks like. There he is.
Without my reading glasses.
Ta-da! And our cherished and esteemed sponsor and friend from Thomson Reuters Labs,
Brian Ulysses. I had the TR Labs in one of 7 data science labs globally for Thomson Reuters.
Here, could you actually just lean in for 1 second?
Sorry.
Now we've got eyes on Brian. Great, and so that's us here. And who we joined by online? I see Tom, Bev, some people.
Yeah.
Some participants are undisclosed. And we're joined by some people that are associated with Identity Ecosystem Steering Committee, which I'm also associated with. We're not representing that, but it's a great group that everyone should learn about. It has some principles that we'll talk about, and OAuth as well, who has a team for the Sovereign Legal Identity Challenge as part of the festival. Well, why don't I just do a screen share on some of the principles that Elizabeth and I surfaced, and then I think maybe Elizabeth, after I just identify some of these, maybe you could share some of your thoughts on the principles that you've been developing. Sound good? Okay. Silence is assent.
I was on mute. Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, thanks. So I don't know, can you see this on the screen? Okay, great. So the first one is sovereign. These are from the Sovereign Trust Framework Principles, which is in section 2. I'm going to link to it. One of them is independence and self-sovereignty. And I won't read the paragraph next to each one, but this one's worth reading because it sets a tone. This principle is an identity owner, which is defined, shall have the right to completely and permanently own and control, and this is interesting, one or more sovereign identities without the need to rely on any external administrative authority and without the fear that a sovereign identity will ever be taken away. So this is a pretty common sentiment I've noticed among folks that talk about this notion of sovereign identity, that it's something that's owned and controlled by the person identified, as opposed to maybe just to draw it out a little bit or to contextualize it. When you go to work, you get a when you log in with Facebook, that's kind of controlled by Facebook, even though it's your username, it's username within Facebook's domain. You kind of go to a government entity. Maybe you want to check your personal earnings and benefit statement, as you should, with the Social Security Administration. that SSN and your login for Social Security Administration is administered by that agency, and they could take it away. They might want to change their system or something. Maybe they, not doing that online service anymore. So a second one is just skip across a few of the top ones.
Tessa, if I could jump in quickly.
Would you please?
I just want to note that some of these principles relate to the technology solution, so the ledger and the network itself, rather than sort of self-sovereign identity in respect of the individual. So just to be clear that, I think it makes sense to jump to some of the others. Yeah,
let's jump to some of the others. Just a couple that I'll just, on the way down, on 2.6 is interoperability. Privacy by design is 2.8. Portability, open by default, and identity for all, and collective best interest. So here's another one that I dug out that, goodness, I remembered. It came from IDQ, which was a nonprofit associated with the Human Dynamics Lab and the Media Lab a few years back. They felt one principle on self-sovereign identity and control of personal data was that individuals and groups should have control of their digital personal identities and personal data. So from their perspective, they really felt it was critical to talk about individual identity and personal data in the same principle. So interesting. Transparent enforcement and effective but lightweight governance was a big thing with ID cubed. Trust and privacy, and open source collaboration. I referenced earlier the NSTIC guiding principles that stands for National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Pretty cool that a government at that time used the word cyberspace as part of an official strategy of the United States. The first principle is identity solutions will be privacy enhancing and voluntary. The second one is identity solutions will be secure and resilient. The third is identity solutions will be interoperable. So there's interoperable again. And the fourth is identity solutions will be cost effective and easy to use. Nice principles, very thoughtful. And I encourage you to read NSTIC. We've linked to it there to kind of get the whole context on that. And then also to look at what's called IDEF, Identity Ecosystem Framework, which goes through, maybe other people on the call are more up to date on it, but we can talk about it, but goes through how you can maybe have products or services certified against those principles and implement those implementations. Christopher Allen self-sovereign identity principles, I feel probably are the most popular nowadays. And he talks about existence, so that you can use this digital identity to have an independent existence. Control, again, access. Users must have access to their own data. Transparency, persistence, over time, long-lived. Portability, there's portability again. Interoperability, consent. Users must agree to the use of their identities. That's sounding like the voluntariness there. Minimalization, disclosure of claims must be minimized. And protection, the rights of users must be protected. Also linked to Jericho Forum, and there's a few others as well. So there's like a smattering there, let's call it, of sort of some of the best of identity, user-controlled or user-owned identity principles that have been circulating around. It's hardly a complete list. And one of the things I was hoping we could do, I see Mary's on the line and others that are, Bev and others who are really been tracking the space. Maybe if there's other principles out there that would be good to add to the list for people to look at and consider, it'd be great to identify those.
All right,
welcome, and also come on in, and also new ideas too. So maybe this is a good time to bat the ball back to you, Elizabeth. And I think that you had some fresh ideas on some principles. You're on mute.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is borrowing sort of a model from property law. And as many of us may remember from law school or 1L property law, you learn about the bundle of rights. and the various, sticks that make up that bundle. And there are 5 key sticks in the bundle, and they are the right to possess, the right to control, the right to exclude, the right to enjoyment, and the right of disposition or to dispose of the property. So it's interesting to think about in the identity context. And actually, if you look at sort of the other principles in the share doc that you've sort of inputted there, many of them are actually have meta principles that are behind them or govern them or link some of the specifically enumerated principles here. And one thing I would like to do and haven't gotten to it is try and categorize those more specific principles into these sort of meta principles based on the property model. And I think it's also interesting that a lot of the self-sovereign identity movement comes out of a frustration and exhaustion with the commercialization of our data, our personal data, which has been treated largely as the property of other, third parties who are not the subject of that data. So this is just something that I've been working on. This seems like a really good forum for it. I'm open to hearing others' thoughts on this idea.
Love it.
Was that Christian?
That was Daza. He was
I was-
adjusting our camera.
Okay.
I was channeling what I imagine Christian's thinking. I don't know. I'll extrapolate though. Also, why I also love it myself is because I think property is one of the areas of a fundamental customary area of law that's under tapped with respect to intangible assets and digital information generally. And among other things, our digital identities it's digital information. And there's other rights that we have. There's human rights, rights that come from privacy law, intellectual property, and so forth. There's also just fundamental personal property. And I think the bundle of rights, like what they call it, bundle of sticks or whatever that you just mentioned, have a lot of application, and we can definitely apply that and extend from those traditional concepts to principles that we ought to be thinking about for our individual identity. That last one of the things you said, the right, did you call it, was it extinguish or?
Disposition, so the right to dispose of is really interesting if you think about it in identity context. Kind of mimics some of what the GDPR is trying to do with the right to be forgotten, of course. But there are other efforts around the world that are kind of that allude to this notion. Just so,
one of the ways, there's of all the different rights that go to property, the right to destroy or put an end to it is one that I associate as much more than most others with how you can tell who's the owner of something. There may be many people that have rights to access or to use in some way or to some of the benefits or obligations for property, but the right to destroy is tightly associated with an ultimate owner. So I think it's an important one. Hey, Mary, I see you're contributing in the text. Would you be willing to speak a few words? Can I read what you're saying?
So I had one question about dispose of. One of the problems that we address actually in real world is digital death. I would suspect that we need to cover that. People do die.
Yeah, so if I could jump in, that's a great point. And actually, this is becoming a big issue with, social media accounts and who owns the social media account postpartum, posthumously, and what can be done with it, and what are the rights? And I think it's a really important point and a really interesting question. And it also goes to the tension between digital identity and sort of real world or offline identity. So yeah, that's something I'd love to work into this framework as well.
Yeah, ditto. On that one, we used to have in Internet Identity Workshop the so-called digital death group, which is possibly the worst named group ever. But we were trying to look at what happens, in probate and just with an executor and in other situations when people, the thing about people with identity is they're born and they die. And so, it's not wonderful to think about it, but it's part of the life cycle, literally. And, if you start poking around the law there, one of the laws that's interesting to look at is the so-called right of publicity. Comes up very much in terms of the rights to image and the rights to the persona for people that can be packaged and dealt with there's methods and mechanisms and rights and obligations that are expected in different roles long after the death of a person. This has been something largely for celebrities in the past, but if you read the statutes, like the first ones in California and the other ones in the United States, they're not limited to celebrities. Any person could be eligible for these rights of publicity, and it's a big. We have what is it? I can't remember the name of it now. There's a new uniform law that deals with another aspect of this. It's a fiduciary access something, and it gets to having an orderly process for people to access your online accounts after death, so that we can have an orderly transition of the disposition of your assets. So it's a good one.
Well, there's another part of death. If in the United States, if you have more than, I think, $5 million in assets, it's up to the federal government to decide when you die. That is, when you cease having liabilities because of the inheritance laws.
Mary, can I, do you mind if I kind of take can I speak some of the comments you're writing in the chat? I don't think they're.
Sure. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep, now you're coming through.
Oh, okay. I couldn't get the mute off for a little while. Sorry about that. So I'm just madly typing in the comments. So I actually have done, but I would say it was several years ago, a bunch of comparison of the notions around property rights versus copyright law and the comparison that you can do around personal data and identity control by the individual. And I guess I would say because of the myriad of different examples that you just brought up, it would be really interesting to maybe make another Google Doc, I don't know, but make a list of all the kinds of property rights and ownership rules and sort of what those contours are in different jurisdictions and domains and compare them to copyright and licensing. So copyright is not an absolute right. So just as a brief refresher, the Constitution calls out the notion of fair use, right? And so there's a couple ways where I think personal data control and identity control is comparable. I don't own my identity 100%. I don't own the absolute rights worldwide to the name Mary Hodder. There are many other Mary Hodders in the world. But I do own, if you paint the big picture of all of my personal data aggregated together, that would pretty much pinpoint me and only me, there's a way where I should have more rights to that than say anybody else. But just my name or just a particular, even an address, people move, someone else moves into my house, I don't own that address. It's pliable, in other words. And so I think the notion of having a spectrum of, licensing in terms of absolute to partial is really interesting. And so it would be good to compare the contours of the law around those things and see if my assessment that copyright was a better match than property rights is still true. So that's one question that I have. And then the other thing is, I think it would be interesting to look at a spectrum of personal data, because personal data can relate back to an identity, right? My zip code and just the month and day of my birth date can pretty much pinpoint me about 93% of the time, right? In the world, and or in the US and the Western world where we have zip codes and that sort of thing, where we have a more consistent mailing system. And so the problem is that it's not just my name or my exact person, I can be derived, right? And so it also, there's also this interesting problem around, you know, what is the data that gets you to an identity, and how much of that, you know, do I own my zip code? No, lots of other people are in it, but maybe I own my zip code plus the month and day of my birth date because it derives me, right? And so it's complicated. And so I would just say, you know, we should really look into the notion of copyright as a better analog for this.
As intellectual property is a better analog.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how would for intellectual property or property, personal property of the type that Elizabeth was saying, how might these legal concepts relate to, you know, the capability of having an account and account ownership and management, where I almost think of it more as a functional capability that enables certain access and authorizations, things that you do with your identity, as it were.
Right, and in that instance, I would say it's more of an analog to property rights, because the account is a thing, even if it's a digital, it's kind of a thing. It's still something you metaphorically hold, right? And so property rights there probably apply more. It would be really interesting to map out, figure out which pieces apply or are an analog to which pieces of law we have, because then we could make more extension around the control that we really should have around these different pieces. So there's some sort of music in the background.
There is.
Somebody doesn't have a mute or what, but I feel like I'm in the ID disco.
So whoever's calling from the discotheque, if you could maybe mute.
There we go. Oh. Well, anyway. So those are just my thoughts, Michael. My 2 cents. And
we've got to be a little careful, Mary. Some of those rights that you're talking about don't belong to you. So in general, the right to, for example, enter a federal building isn't your property, even though it's a right that you may have associated with you from time to time.
I agree with you. I mean, that what I'm suggesting is that we actually map it and figure out where these things apply, write it down and kind of figure it out, versus I'm not asserting any particular right.
Okay. We're actually missing 3 of the most important, most expensive topics, which everybody seems to leave out because they don't want to talk about the hard problems. But the hard problems generally are proofing, recovery, and redress. And Mary could talk about recovery with respect to Skype at great length. But the point is that if you are you and you have some identity and you lose access, you need a way to recover that access.
That was someone named Tom, I think.
Tom Jones, yeah.
Which Tom?
Tom Jones. So Tom is, sorry to out you, Tom, if you didn't want to be outed, but Tom is works a lot with me and a couple of other folks on this call around the IDESG effort to create the IDEF registry. Sorry for the massively horrible acronyms. But basically, Tom is a really deep thinker around identity and these issues. And so anyway, that was his. I just put it in the chat so that we would have those. I agree. I mean, proofing, recovery, redress, these are all super important topics. I would love to take a look at your document. If you wouldn't mind. Bev also mentioned wanting to take a look. I mean, you can just make us commenters if you don't want us to edit or anything, but I'd be happy to add stuff that I know about if I see something that isn't in there already.
That would be really great. The reason we want to, or what I think it's good that we have this as more of an open dialogue right now, is precisely to get more voices, especially people familiar with the area who've been thinking about it. So I just put a link in there to the wiki page where there's another copy of the information, and it's editable, and we'd really love it if you could add to it. But just to go back to what Tom was, hi Tom, what Tom was saying, proofing, recovery, and redress. On the redress topic, it's what that calls to mind for me is very much when you think about legal identity for a person, a legal person, a human being, or a corporate entity. In this case, one of the hallmarks is that you are a legal person when you can sue and be sued, and when you can enter a contract. You know, like a bot at this point, or like a lawnmower or a blender cannot enter a contract. It cannot be a signatory. It's not a legal person. You enter a contract, you can enforce the contract, and it can be enforced against you. This is an indicia of redress, I'd say. And so it seems to me like redress in particular has a lot of connotations from a legal dimension on what an identity is, and therefore perhaps what it would mean to have dominion over one's own identity. So, good one.
Question, I'm gonna have to drop off in a few minutes, but I want to pick up on the point about recovery, because personally, I think this is the biggest challenge in the digital realm is, you know, I'm unsatisfied with every sort of proposed solution that I've seen. And it feels as though, you know, sort of the best one I've seen at this stage is some kind of, you know, social recovery where you have, you know, a trusted group of people who effectively vouch for your identity. But even that leaves me very, very unsatisfied. I'm just wondering what thoughts are on the best proposals people have seen put forth, because I think it's a really important point that whatever the model, whether it's property or copyright or some other model that we borrow, I think if you don't have an effective way to recover your identity or one of your identities, probably in the future, you know, to some extent, it's meaningless. So I'd just like to crowdsource thoughts on that.
Can I jump, Daz? Can I jump in?
Yeah, I think we have like a clarifying question first, if you don't mind, from Bob Craig, who's in the room in Boston here.
I'm just curious, when you say you find the social recovery unsatisfying, can you expound on that a little bit as to why?
Well, so personally, full disclosure, my favorite show is Black Mirror, and I very much believe in the imminent dark side of a lot of technology, not because it was, you know, intentionally designed to be a certain way, but because it's unforeseeable sometimes. So just like you have, you know, a movement of former social media engineers now saying we didn't know what we were building and we wish we could undo it. I just think that I'm skeptical of most approaches. With social recovery, I think, you know, things change, right? Relationships change. People leave, people change, people die. And your identity is contextual, and so and incentives might be an issue as well. So I'm just I guess because I haven't seen a good sort of practical implementation, that's why I'm skeptical. That being said, again, I think it's one of the better options, and I think there are obviously ways to, you know, better and worse ways to implement that option. But I guess that's my clarification.
Great. Thanks. And who was seeking to speak? Was it?
That was Jim.
Great.
I work with Mary and Tom. I'm chair of the user committee. Work very closely with Mary and the IDF. And I like what Elizabeth shared regarding property. And we get down into the whole area of authenticated identities. And I think we need the collective mindset of this group to put together, because I really believe one's identity, once authenticated, is property. Then you can take the tentacles beyond that, but it is you. Now, you have to authenticate it. We have to really expand that definition, but now that NIST 863.3 is in place, we at least have a platform to explore the context of what those authenticated attributes can be. That lends to this greater argument and discussion that we've had here, because then it does to Elizabeth's point, property. Because now Mary gave a broad definition to the zip code and things of that nature. If I can really narrow this down, and I happen to be in healthcare, and what's really made it interesting is just earlier, 2 months ago, ONC has now come out with a whole platform dealing with the trust exchange framework, and they're focusing now on the user. You can come get your data. You can view it, download it, and share it. You just have to prove who you are. Validate it. Now we're coming back to 863.3. So we have some dynamics in play here that you take this brain trust online and start harmonizing to Elizabeth's kind of opening salvo that says, hey, can we do something? Can we orchestrate it? I think it's dynamic. Yes, I do. I really think we can empower this group. Take it on the private sector and make it happen, because then we can force the public sector and government. You can't depend on them. You've got to do it in the private sector. This is an opportunity.
Here, here.
Just my 2 cents.
Good to hear. ONC, Office of the National Coordinator in the healthcare space, is taking that on. I wasn't aware of that. Just to extrapolate a little bit on the recovery, when Tom first said it, I wasn't. I guess I was thinking about the remedies more, as I mentioned. But on recovery, now that I think about it, if you look at least in the personal property realm, and have to think about intellectual property more, and maybe do that with the mapping that Mary said. But in the personal property realm, there's actually a nice body of law for hundreds of years. When someone loses personal property and someone else finds it, there's a whole set of factors that one could look at to evaluate whether the original owner, or under what circumstances the original owner gets to get it back. And so we've got principles of holder in due course, and many others, that some of which could be, or maybe modern extensions of them could be applicable to recovery of an account or recovery of a credential when it's been compromised, because that can be such a tough thing. I know Dan Combs used to say that when he was dealing with identity fraud, frequently the fraud artist that's stolen one's identity is much more persuasive than the person whose identity was stolen when they're trying to struggle to get it back. So principles of holder in due course, and maybe some others for lost property, which have already been addressed over centuries now in common law. So many permutations of the same old situation of someone stealing your stuff, or someone converting your stuff, or someone coming across your stuff and not wanting to give it back when they should, could maybe be dusted off here, and we could look to apply some for recovery. Recovery is a great one.
I think that there's a big problem. If you depend upon the legal system to get your identity back, you'll probably starve to death and die before it actually is recovered. The biggest problem with loss of identity is not just getting it back, but then the redress of undoing all of that damage that was created in your name while your identity was gone. The costs there are tremendous. You can buy $1 million property damage claim insurance now to cover that problem.
And that's an interesting area you see too, or sort of proposals, identity related insurance and other, as you mentioned, sort of disaster recovery proposals as well. So Mary, if you want, I'm happy to start the property section, and you can maybe help me with the copyright section, and we can map those too.
Yeah, that sounds good. I also think, when Daza, when you were just bringing up the notion of, fraud versus, in property it would be theft, but there's the notion in property law around conversion. And conversion is a really interesting one, because even if you don't know that the property is stolen, if you profit from it, there's a civil version of it and a criminal version. And the criminal version, of course, like everything criminal, has a very high bar of proving that you know, you converted it and you did stuff with it and you knew you were converting it and all of that. But the civil version is actually really easy to deal with. So if, I don't know, your neighbor cuts down your tree and sells it for 25 grand, which now, you know, a nice beefy old growth tree can fetch. I know someone who did this. They essentially just sued their neighbor for conversion and of their property, and were handed legal fees plus $25,000. And it would be really interesting also in this legal page to take a look at some of those things that might be remedies against entities that, so for example, Cambridge Analytics, which has just gotten nailed for taking Facebook data inappropriately. They said they deleted it. They didn't delete it. What if the 50 million users, if Facebook is forced to disclose to any of us who might be in that group, then, you know, because there was a monetary value for the conversion of our data, essentially the taking of it and converting of it to value in the election, you know, sued Cambridge Analytica in a class action lawsuit for conversion. You know, that would be an interesting, that would be a really interesting case. And it would rely on property rights because that's what conversion is about. But it's, you know, it's sort of like they took the account data. You know, I think you could make the argument there that you know, property is at play. And so, you know, so doing this mapping of the current laws and seeing how they might apply to our digital data and lives would be fascinating, because it might be a way to push back and get some traction, you know, that way. Because I'm not sure that our lawmakers are anywhere close to understanding what the people in this room get, you know.
Here, here. Conversion, trespass to chattel. There's a few, yeah, we should probably get a few in the wiki and just cross-reference them and map them, as you said, Mary.
Yeah. And
with the tree, just one quick thing with the tree is that, you know, so, to some extent, trees are almost like commodities, but a tree on a property, it's an old growth tree, is also so unique, and you know, there's something ineffable about it that goes beyond the raw monetary value of it. You know, when you get into the family history with the tree and the emotional attachment, just the fact that it's living, there's something. I think that's a particularly poignant analogy to what's lost when one's identity is lost. And I'm sorry, I think I interrupted you, Mary.
No, it's okay. What's interesting about the tree example for me is that the conversion, the civil conversion charge that was made against the neighbor, the only recovery that they were able to get was the actual value of what the person took, right? Whether or not they went down the street and sold the tree for 25 cents, it was worth 25,000 on the open market. And so that's what, you know, so the question is how, then you would have to look at what is, you know, the taking of an account in a context, in a you know, divisive and contested election, and the amount of money that was spent on that election per vote. You might be able to make the argument that, you know, $2 billion or $3 billion spent for, you know, 100 million votes, you know, I don't know. I mean, there's various ways that you could value this, but you could, or the amount of money that was spent with Cambridge Analytica, you know, I mean, it would be kind of fascinating to try to track the economic damages and see if that wouldn't be a way to, you know, to push back for the individual.
Does this mean that adverse possession would apply as well?
Don't know.
I don't reclaim, if I don't reclaim something, I lose it?
What if you don't know about it? I mean, it's
I don't think adverse possession matters.
Well, no, if it's a property, right? So let's say you have a property.
Yes, if it's a property. We had an adverse possession problem in our homeowners association where the guy didn't know he lost the property, and he didn't know it for long enough that he lost it.
Oh, interesting. Well, that example might be different, but I'm thinking of the example that's often plays out in like a law school class is the one where the guy has a property halfway through the block and he doesn't fence it, and people walk through the property every day for 5 years. And once the, you know, in theory, the guy has visited his property once in the 5 years and can see people walking through, didn't bother to fence it, and now those people claim that they have a right to pass through. And so while he doesn't lose the whole property, he essentially is forced to make a public easement, and can't, refence it. And so,
does that apply to your identity?
So,
well,
if you don't use it?
I'm just giving the property example where the individual is essentially considered to be on notice when their own property is used every day by other people. So it's like, if you knew your Facebook data was being used in an obvious manner, that would be one thing. But if if it was completely opaque and you didn't know, would you fall into the category you're talking about, Tom? I don't know. I mean, I'd really have to think about it and look at the law and see if there was some way to apply it there. I don't know.
And that's different in every single state too.
Yeah.
Daz?
Yes.
This is Jim. Let me bring up a parallel discussion, federated identities. I want to bring us back on track, because we get in federated identities, we have a distributed system, just to something that Elizabeth has been doing from the sovereign side. So in healthcare, and part of why I bring up what ONC is doing, because it's a distributed system on a federated side. Okay, so just throw that out there, because I think we need to look at it also. Here comes Elizabeth.
Well, an interesting clarification. I think a federated model is actually quite different from a self-sovereign model. I think a federated model, or even a social login model or the like, are still very much controlled by a third party. I think the self-sovereign model is really, the focus is really on flipping the ownership to where, the user owns and controls their data, going back to that first independence and ownership principle, or, again, the property right model. So while I agree with you, I think it's important to make that distinction, because I think there are limits to federation. I think, like I said, we've seen a lot of federated models that have created a lot of problems. So I just want to be clear that the sovereign sort of implementation is different.
But how can you not link those things? Because you're going to wind up with a person who is also an MD and has a DEA license. So you bound the real person identity to the federated identity.
So I think this goes to having multiple, identities. And again, not that the individual necessarily has multiple identities, but that it's contextual to the relationship. So there might be relationships that you have that are part of a transactional, part of a transaction or a relationship where you need more or less data points to establish different levels of identity. So, the identity you need to establish with your doctor might be different from the identity you need to establish with your employer or your university, or, there might be information that's not germane to a certain relationship. And so the emphasis would really be on minimizing and, data that's not relevant. And this goes into the, specifics of implementation. But, I think it's important to keep in mind that in the future, we might not have one single identity, but sort of a more contextual, purpose-built version of several different identities.
Yeah, just to wind that back a little bit. There's another aspect too, I think, that gets to maybe not federation in the SAML or Open ID Connect sense of the word federation, but the distribution of an identity credential that could be considered sovereign would presumably also include the right to provide some control to others, such as to delegate to another person, whether it's an attorney or a fiduciary, or maybe software operated by a business on your behalf. I think that might be one plausible entry point where you could start to look at possible fact patterns in the future, where you've got folks that are maybe unknowingly and innocently coming into possession of identity credentials or attributes of identity, using them almost like they would with the analogy of the easement across your property, and then maybe gaining reputation, gaining benefit from it legitimately and gaining value. And I think in addition to the monetary questions of who owes who how much money, to me this seems like maybe in the mapping we could do with Mary and others would be equitable remedies. When we start looking at other ways to other ways to separate, like the expectations of parties in a fair and creative way that that can extend beyond a monetary settlement, but maybe could go to some sort of application of portability, or taking some of the attributes out and applying them to a different account, or something like that. But I guess I just want to say, looking at equitable remedies in addition to monetary remedies maybe is part of the mapping we should do.
Daz, I think Bev brought up a really interesting and important point in the chat on the difference between identification and authentication. Identification being an individual trying to make a claim about their identity or identify themselves, and then a third party authenticating that claim. And I don't want to, Bev brought it up, so I'll let her speak to it. But I just think that also is really interesting in the context of what you just said, because the remedies might depend on sort of which aspect of identity we're talking about.
Here, here. Question: if we were to do a mapping, oh, I've got the 2-minute warning here. But if we were to do a mapping, how could one structure mapping to different areas of law and different facets of identity? Like, what would be the things we should map, and how could we do it?
So with the property model, I was going to start with, bundle of rights, and then maybe sort of kinds of infringements, and then remedies. And then, I don't know if that's going to mirror one-to-one with other models, but, and I don't know that they all have to have a one-to-one relationship, but that was sort of my proposal.
And then maybe layering on intellectual property. Oh, Mary?
Yeah, I was going to say, if nothing else, just literally starting from a list of laws and quoting the code, maybe in, I don't know, I mean, this might be better in a wiki or something, or in GitHub with sub pages for the actual quote, but being able to tie together the general concepts and build what you're trying to do is say, well, where are the limits of these laws that existed prior to anything digital, and then how would we apply them? How would they be applied to a digital context, let's say? And, I think it would probably be the sort of thing that, if a working group got together, and I would love to join a group like that, because this is actually, I've been wanting to do the copyright side of this for a long time. Literally from 20 years ago, I think I wrote my first blog post on, how I wanted to copyright my clickstream and what was the law around it and how would I do it. But it would be really interesting I think we would have to figure it out as we went along. I think we cataloged everything first and figured out a structure so that we could refer back to the original text. And of course, to Tom's point, it's like, yeah, there's 50 different states that deal with some of this, but it would be very interesting. I mean, it would be a fascinating contribution to kind of the public discussion around these issues, because this does come up periodically, and it has come up regularly for me in the past 20 years around this, from all different angles and all different kinds of groups. There's certainly been sessions at W3C, conferences that have to do with do not track and personal rights, user submitted rights or user submitted terms. And, it has to do with, all these issues that we deal with around identity and personal data control, and whether you're starting with an identified person or they own an account, or you're deriving, data. I would imagine doing it in a really big way, and doing it in a way that, was meant to just document and kind of lay out, and maybe at the end there's a paper in it, asserting, a law review article, something. I mean, so maybe at the end we go get some lawyer like Scott David and we say, all right, let's write a law review article. And where's the right publication for this? Does it go in the Property Rights Journal? Does it go in the Copyright Journal? Maybe there's two, I don't know. But it would be fascinating I think it would be a fascinating project and well worth the time, because, because ultimately, and there have been people who, there's a few people, there's a guy, a lawyer in DC who the Customer Commons group talks to periodically, and we talk about, you know, ways that we could go after abusers of personal data and identity. There's, you know, people in New York that we've talked with who are sort of more on the media side. But, you know, this is a topic that comes up, and I don't think anybody's done this. And I think it would be a huge way to move this whole discussion forward, to do the work and get the paper out there and, you know, make it citable. I mean, that's how you change law. You make law review articles that get cited in court cases, you know?
I'm in. Well,
Okay.
we have a wiki anyway to as one place we can start to peck away at things, and you know, we made the GitHub repository specifically to have a place to get started. So you're welcome to use that. And are you going to be at IIW, Mary, this April?
You know, I don't know. I'm supposed to go to the No Identity Conference in DC, which is right before. And it turns out that the IIW thing is like literally the day after Easter and Passover and everything else. And so there's sort of a lot of people traveling around and trying to, you know, manage our schedules and interface with all the people who are going on spring break. So I haven't totally decided because of that complication.
Well, so something to think about, maybe maybe like a little sidebar at No Identity IAW, or one of the next likely candidates among the Identirati coming up, where we can keep talking about this. And one concept that we had when Elizabeth and I were chatting, we circulate around a little bit to Bob Craig and to Drummond and some others, Christian here, was to maybe convene people that are interested in the topic, which we can convene at MIT, just because I can book the room in the media lab. But we can also absolutely convene around this in particular. But it might be more realistic to look at things that are happening where enough people interested in the topic are already going to be, and maybe get some people together in person. And in the meantime, you know, GitHub is, as always, our friend, and I would like to invite and encourage everybody that's participating now, and everyone that sees the YouTube later, to share your thoughts and to help expand on this and deepen it, because it does seem like it's timely and it's important. So let's keep pecking at it.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Well, Elizabeth is going to teach people now, so she had to jump off before this moment, but I guess as the remaining facilitator, I'll gavel it closed. I want to thank everybody for participating, and we'll do a report out in the Boston MIT node for the Computational Law and Blockchain Festival, and share our notes, and look forward to collaborating with you all on this going forward. So, thanks for joining. Bye.